In this video, I'm going to go through the 5 main opening development schemes in the Chebanenko Slav, or the Chameleon Slav. And the really cool thing about the Chameleon Slav is that if you understand these 5 development schemes, you don't have to memorize as much, because if you can remember these schemes and understand them, then you can try to figure out which scheme to play during the game based on what your opponent does. And that will cut down the amount of lines that you have to memorize. So my thought is I'm going to go through these 5 development schemes in this video. And then I want to make further videos where I'll have model games for each of the development schemes. And I'll also spend more time on the strategy and general ideas of our main development scheme. So let's look at the Chameleon Slav here. So this is like the main position in the Chameleon Slav, and this A6 move is the key idea. And so I did make a video to explain the purpose of that A6, and it's very important to understand the ideas behind A6 and the reason for it. So I'll put a link up here that you can watch that video. I would recommend watching that video first. So this is the general starting position of the mainline Chameleon Slav. Now, like I said, there's 5 main development schemes that we aim for that will cover us in the vast majority of situations. So the main development scheme that we go for is what you see on the screen right here. And that's where we have our bishop either on f5 or g4, our dark squared bishop on either e7 or d6, and then we castle, we have e6, and knight b to d7. And I'll do videos in the future where we explain the ideas. We'll kind of explore the main strategical ideas, like playing e5 or c5, among other things. And but first, I think we'll focus on the alternative development schemes that we play when we cannot set up this structure here under favorable circumstances. So let's go through each one. There's 4 alternatives to this main development scheme, and we'll go through them one at a time. So this would be our first alternative development scheme. And what you notice is that white has played a4, and in those situations we will generally play a5 at some point. And the idea is that now this b4 square is a permanent weakness in white's camp, and we will use that as like our base of operations. So we'll get a knight there or a bishop there. So let's look at how that would come about in a game, and why. I think one of the keys to understanding is when we decide to play e6 and lock in our light squared bishop. So let's look at how this would actually come about. So we're playing our Slav here, our Chameleon Slav. And how this would come about is if they played a4 right here on move 5. And they may do that because they're used to playing that in a traditional Slav when we have exchanged d takes c, so that we can't hold on to that extra pawn. And they may just develop that way against this Chameleon Slav, either because they prefer to do that or they don't understand the point of a6. So we play, when they play a4, we play e6. And so the question is, well, why would we lock in our bishop? Because we want to get our bishop normally to f4, or I'm sorry, to f5 or to g4. So the point of playing this e6 is that we know this b4 square is permanently weak, and we want to be able to use that square at some point, but we don't want white to be able to play a5. And so this e6 move basically shuts down the a5 idea by white. And so why is that? Well, let's just look at it real quickly. If they played a5 right here, we could play c5, you know, and the idea being is then we're going to play knight to c6, and this will be a nightmare for white, because now we'll have the bishop and the knight hitting that pawn, and there's just no good way for white to proceed in this position. And so it's not likely that they'll play a5, but you might have people play it against you, and if you do, you'll end up getting a very good position. So that's the whole reason that we play e6 here, even though it locks in our light squared bishop. And so let's look at how this might develop. White could play, for instance, bishop to g5, and then we just play a5. And now we have this b4 square as a permanent weakness and as a base of operations. So in this position, we would likely play our bishop to e7, since we have this pin going on, and that breaks that pin. And then we would play knight to a6, and then we could camp our knight on b4, where it'll sit very nicely. You know, it could also come about if they play g3. Well, we could, even in this case, we could move our bishop out to b4 and play a6. Or we could play a5 right away if we wanted. Or we could play bishop to b4. It's kind of our choice. But the main point is that we're gonna just make sure we get a5 in and use this b4 square that's been weakened. So this is our first alternative development scheme. So we'll just call it alternative setup number 1. And like I said, I'll come back and look for like a model game or two with this kind of setup. So this is like one alternative to our main setup. Let's look at, like I said, there's 4 of them, 4 alternatives. So let's look at the second one. And the second one is where we play b5 and c5, and then we develop our bishop to b7. And this comes about after we do d5 takes c4. Then we play b5 and c5. So let's look at a couple positions, potential lines where this setup, alternative setup, would come about. So we're doing our standard Slav move order here. And let's say they play e3. Well, if they do that, we can continue with our standard Chameleon Slav setup. And let's say in this position they played bishop to d3. And they may do this because they're trying to prevent our bishop from going to the f5 square. So here we can go into this alternative setup. And what we do is we take on c4. So now their bishop has to move twice. They spend two tempos moving this bishop. And now we play e6. And we do this to facilitate our ability to play c5, because we know we're going to be able to play b5 and gain a tempo on that bishop, and then we'll be able to play c5. So it might go something like this, and then we can get our c5 break in. And if you look, we achieved this setup right here. And then now we'll be able to develop, instead of developing our bishop on this c8 to h3 diagonal that we do in our main Slav setup, we'll develop it instead to b7. So let's look at another way that this could come up. So let's say we get to this position. We're going right. We think we're going down our main line Chameleon Slav here, and they play queen to b3. Well, we could do the same kind of trick that we did in that last line, where we take on c4, they have to take, and now we gain this tempo playing b5. The queen has to move away, and now we play e6 because we're going to use that bishop, dark squared bishop, to facilitate this c5 break. And this will be just like, the last line we looked at, where we get our c5 break in, and then we play bishop to b7. So once again, we can see we have this alternative setup too, we called it. Now let's look at the third alternative setup, and this one's a little bit more aggressive for us. And in this setup, we play, after we play e6, we play c5, and then we play knight to c6. And this is a more aggressive way of attacking white center. So you can see now we got a lot of pressure on d4, and let's look at it. Let's look at how this may come about. So we got kind of our main setup, and let's say they play a4 here. Well, we know from our first alternative setup that we play e6 here because we want to prevent white from playing a5. So now let's say they play bishop to f4. Well, then we can hit them with c4 and aggressively contest the center. So let's say they play maybe e2. See how we can kind of dissolve their center here? And now we actually have a favorable version of the isolated queen pawn, the isolani, for us. So that worked out well, and that came about because we were able to put all this pressure on d4. So let's look at something else they may do from this position. We just looked at bishop to e2. Let's say, well, what if they tried to liquidate as well, capturing towards the center, which seems logical enough. Well, that's fine for us too, because we're actually fine just putting our queen in the center here, and we actually have a slight advantage in this position. So once again, both of these positions came about by playing c5 and a quick knight to c6, putting a lot of pressure on d4. And then there's one more alternative setup scheme that we can use, and that actually involves a kingside fianchetto. And let's take a look at that setup. So that setup is here, and you notice we've set up our kingside fianchetto. And let's look at how this may come about in a game. Now, this can commonly come about if white plays queen to c2 here. And so you can see that they're controlling, this queen controls f5, which is where we would normally want to put our light squared bishop. So we can't develop our light squared bishop there. And also, here's a really interesting thing, and this will make more sense if you watch that first video on our purpose of a6. Normally, a6 provides us protection against queen to b3 maneuvers because we can play our rook to a7 there, or we can play b5. But there's kind of a unusual circumstance here where that doesn't work, because you might wonder in this position here, well, it would be logical to think, well, we can't develop the light squared bishop to f5 because the queen controls that square. So let's just throw it out here to g4. And actually, for one kind of unusual circumstance or reason, or a concrete specific idea here for white, you can't actually get away with that. Now, you probably wouldn't likely see this until you got to a very high level. But what white can do is they can employ this queen move where they attack b7 and threaten to take here on d5 with that idea from the first video, which I recommend watching if you haven't seen that. So interestingly, this is one rare exception where our Chebanenko, chameleon idea of playing a6 doesn't bail us out in this concrete position. Because if we play rook to a7, you think, okay, well, I'm okay here. My rook controls b7, and I have two pieces protecting d4 to counter their two pieces that are attacking it until they play g4. We have to move the bishop out of the way, and they have this incredible resource of playing g5. And so then we have to move the knight away, and then, of course, that removes the defender of that pawn, and they can just grab that pawn. So normally our a6 move would sidestep these shenanigans by white, but in this rare specific circumstance, it doesn't. And because of that, we need to come up with an alternative development plan. So let's zoom back to this position. We know we can't get away just playing g4 here, our bishop to g4. So what we're going to do is we're going to Fianchetto on the king side and then keep the c8 to h3 diagonal open so that we can develop that bishop on that diagonal when we are no longer threatened by this maneuver by white. So it might go something like this. And now we can actually get away with doing this. And this would be like a common typical position we would get in these queen to c2 lines. We just drop our bishop back, and our idea would be, one potential idea would be to play c5, at some point, and then open up our Fianchettoed bishop. So those are the four main alternative opening development schemes for black in the Chameleon Slav. And I think the great thing about the Chameleon is that if you can remember and understand these development schemes, you can usually figure out when to play which scheme, and that just makes you have to memorize a lot less. So, these alternative schemes come about when white does something that makes it so it's not to our advantage to set up our standard Slav setup like this. And that's when we use those four development schemes. So, like I said, my plan is to make some videos with model games in each of these alternative development schemes, and then to go back and start examining key ideas in this main Chebanenko Slav setup that we will get the majority of the time. But we just want to understand the alternatives so that when this position is an ideal, then we just have four ideas that we kind of have in our memory bank, and we can figure out which one best applies for that specific circumstance. So my suggestion would be, watch this video a couple times and just try to remember these alternative development schemes. Play some games in the Chebanenko Slav or Chameleon Slav. Aim for this setup right here. And then after the games, go through, look up in a database, to see what the ideal way of playing that position was, and then compare it to these five setups. And then things will start to crystallize and make a little bit more sense. So anyway, I hope you found that video useful, and I plan on doing quite a bit more on the key ideas and understanding for the Chebanenko Slav. I think it's a really great opening, especially for adult improvers, because if we can understand these ideas, then we don't have to memorize as much stuff. And I mean, to be honest, who wants to memorize a bunch of crap? I'd rather be bad at chess than have to memorize, 600 lines of theory. But the cool thing about the Chebanenko is that we don't have to memorize very much. That that understanding that kingside Fianchetto and that reasons why bishop to g4 didn't work there, that's about as like tricky or memorization intensive as you kind of get. So anyway, hope you enjoyed it. Take care.